Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each game and section in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of them. Now we've just looked at game number 50 and before game number 51, Reti offers quite a deep analysis of two opening systems, the Cambridge Springs Defence and the Westphalia Defence. Now, it goes quite deep, so I'm going to do this as its own video, and then game 51 will be a game played by Capablanca with the Cambridge Springs Defence. Now, the Cambridge Springs Defence starts off with d4. Oh, there's a bit of lag here. d5, c4, e6. So we're starting off with the Queen's Gambit. e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, knight b to d7, and e3. So all fairly normal things. There's nothing unusual here. And we've looked at this sort of opening quite a few times in the series. It's a normal Queen's Gambit declined. Now, the most orthodox way of continuing is perhaps with h6 or bishop e7. You could potentially even take, you could play c6. So there's quite a few different ways you can continue. Normally, the ways which we've looked at so far have included h6, bishop b7, and a c5 pawn break. However, there are two other ways that black can try and play this. So instead of trying to play a more defensive game, black can try and counterattack. And the best way to counterattack is after this e3 pawn has been pushed, black can try and exploit this weak dark square diagonal because this bishop is now outside of the pawn chain. And that brings us on to these defenses. So there are two types of defenses. The Westphalia is when you would play bishop b4 straight away, pinning the knight, putting pressure onto this c3 knight here, and sort of exploiting the fact this bishop is outside the pawn chain. Now this is a bit more aggressive. Usually c5 often follows at some point, and it is a bit more aggressive, but it's not quite as sound. It's focused a bit more on the idea of a counterattack. The more solid way to respond is c6, which is the start of the Cambridge Springs Defence. So bishop b4 is the Westphalia Defence. c6 starts with the Cambridge Springs Defence. You get this triangle here. And then after knight f3, queen to a5. This is the Cambridge Springs Defence. Now, obviously we want to try and utilise this diagonal. Now, Capablanca has actually here, instead of knight f3, played a3 here to essentially stop any bishop b4 ideas, and potentially even stop any queen a5 ideas, because b4 is on the cards as well. But knight f3 is probably the most common move, and the main move. Queen a5 is then played. And now, the threat here is, let's say you just try and continue developing. So straight away we've got this threat here. So let's say you try and defend it with this. Then knight e4 can come, attacking this bishop. Let's say bishop f4. You can then have the bishop coming here. And you start seeing everything is starting to pile up along here. And of course something like a3 doesn't actually really threaten anything. So black can just castle and they can't take, because the rook would hang. So things do start piling up quite quickly. And another thing about the move queen a5 is it's x-raying this bishop. So let's say we just have some normal moves like this. Sure, let's say we take and then we push here. Although, actually, no, white has castled, so that wouldn't quite work. So let's say bishop e2, knight e4. Let's say queen c2. Now if we take here, and white takes back, and bishop goes to here. Now we see some of the issues, in that there's this very long pin along this diagonal, threatening the knight, and we also have two attackers on this bishop. So things start to get really quite awkward. Now, of course, here white can just take on e4, because after this capture, things start getting a bit unclear. But there's some of the key motives of this defense. If you start playing some mistakes, then you may well end up having this bishop hanging. You may well lose the exchange because of this knight as well. So it's quite a strong counter-attack. So because of that, the main move after queen a5 is knight to d2. Now knight d2 breaks the pin, but it also helps add a defender to this e4 square, so knight to e4 isn't quite as strong. And likewise, after we take, we can always take here with a knight again. But it also has another idea. If we go back to the very start, d4, d5, we've looked a few times at different pawn breaks in structures. So here the pawn breaks are c4 and e4. Now c4 we can play straight away in the Queen's Gambit, in d4, d5 openings, because the d5 pawn is defended by the queen, and we can recapture this pawn very easily by just pushing the e pawn, because we'd straight away gain control of the center and be able to capture this pawn back. But they're the pawn breaks, c4 and e4. So if we go back to knight to d2, knight d2 is very good in that it adds another attacker to this e4 square, making the e4 pawn break a potential option in the future. However, the knight on f3 does, however, defend the e5 square. And just as here, e4 and c4 are white's pawn breaks, c5 and e5 are black's pawn breaks. And the knight on f3 is potentially stopping this e5 pawn break. And by moving it, although we are allowing an e4 pawn break and stopping any knight e4 ideas, we are making e5 a potential option for black. Now Reti comments as well in this position that although knight to d2 does slow down black's counterattack on the queen side, it makes it a bit less effective, since white has black is still able to proceed. The opening is still quite sound for black, because white is able to stop black's counterattack, but this e5 pawn break is now on the cards, because in stopping it they have weakened their control over the e5 square. Now here, instead of knight to d2, actually, Reti comments that Tavash recommends c takes d5. However, Reti dislikes this because knight takes d5 is a potential option. Black has no obligation to take back with either pawn, and now we see that this counterattack is getting a bit stronger each time. Now this is still a completely fine move, but it's why give black these chances? So knight d2 is the main line. And now bishop b4, still continuing to try and add some pressure along this c3 and the c3 square and on the queen side. We see queen to c2. And now in the game, we're following the game by Bogolubov versus Grunwald. Now they castled. However, Reti comments that Alekhine has tried d takes c4 before against Capablanca, and he scored quite well with it. Oh, sorry, because the idea is here bishop takes f6 was played, because obviously the bishop is hanging. So bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, And now knight takes c4 was played, attacking the queen. So now queen c7. And now, after castling, black will continue to essentially improve their position ever so slightly. So they'll try to they'll get their rooks onto the c8 and d8 squares. The bishop will often retreat back to the d7, to the d8 and f8 squares, and the queen may retreat back to the b8 square, and then we can try and push c5. Nice little colourful picture there. So it's quite similar to most Queen's Gambit Decline's openings, where you would try and get the c5 pawn break in, and you'll do that by putting the rooks on c8 and d8, the bishops on e8 and f8, and the queen possibly on b8. That's sort of how you'll continue. Now, Reti comments that this method of opening hasn't really been explored in much depth, and so it's not really that clarified, so he can't really offer many variations or critique of it. And looking at the Masters game database, there's been 50 games in this position, and the engine evaluates it as a very slight advantage for white. So we probably still can't really comment too much on it. Now that all starts after queen c2, d takes c4. But in the game by Bogolyubov versus Grunwald, we see black chooses to short castle. And now bishop e2. And now black plays e5. So, like I said, this knight to d2 move weakens the e5 square. So now e5 is a possibility. Now, in the game, we see d takes e5, followed by knight to e4, attacking this bishop. And because of that, instead of bishop e2, Capablanca here tried bishop h4 instead. However, here e5 is a little bit stronger because white hasn't quite finished their development as much as they had in the previous variation. And so here we see bishop takes f6, then knight takes f6, d takes e5, and now knight to e4. And so it's almost transposed into the same position as before, except this bishop is still on f1. So it's not quite as good. So because of that, bishop e2 here is what Reti recommends. And now e5 was played in the game by Grunwald and Bogolyubov. Now, Reti comments that this move was considered almost a refutation to white's method of developing their pieces. However, Reti also adds that he sort of cautions against just blindly following opening books and things, in that actually it wasn't really a refutation. In reality, white probably should gain the advantage. Now in the game, we saw d takes e5, knight to e4. We see knight d takes e4, one of the advantages of playing knight to d2. D takes e4, castles, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight takes e5. Now, in the game, we see queen takes e4, which was a bit of a mistake. Reti comments that bishop e7 was probably a bit better, aiming to try and most likely reroute the bishop. Bishop b4 will be quite good, and the bishop's just a little bit safer here, it's a little bit more active. But in the game, queen takes e4 was played. However, this allowed black to actually win the queen. f6 was played, and now bishop f4. And this bishop f4 was the main fatal move, really. Because now black can win the queen with bishop to f4. bishop to f5. And the issue is the queen has no safe squares. You know, the queen can't retreat down this diagonal. It can't go to here. It can't take. It can't go here. It can't go here. So the queen has two squares which aren't immediately defended. It has d4 and it has f5. Now if it goes to d4, then rook a to d8 and the queen is trapped again. If it takes here, then knight f3 check, and black's won the queen for 2 minor pieces. Now this could potentially be avoided with bishop h4, but again things will start to get a bit more complicated. But that's the Cambridge Springs defence. Now the only thing worth noting is it this variation? Oh yeah, okay, so that was the Cambridge Springs defence. I thought there was a gambit of a pawn, but there wasn't. That's in the next variation. So that's the Cambridge Springs defence. That starts off after c6 and queen a5. The next variation, which would start with immediately bishop to b4, is the Westphalia Defence, which we will look at now. So e6, and it starts off very similar. Knight b to d7, e3, and now here bishop b4 is the Westphalia Defence. Now Reti comments that the Westphalia Defence has the disadvantage of showing your cards too soon, really, because white doesn't have to play knight f3 here. They could play bishop d3 and then knight to e2. Knight to e2, defending this knight, which sort of takes away any counter-attacking ideas black will have by trying to get this battery along this weak diagonal. And so Reti comments that Westphalia Defence by this move order is perhaps a little bit inaccurate because it shows white black's hand immediately and gives white chances to quite easily counter it. Now they may not be the most critical, but they are chances to most easily counter it. Therefore, he recommends you start it by the Nimzo-Indian move order. Knight f6 first, because then after c4, e6. Now knight c3 would obviously lead to a Nimzo-Indian, so you have to be prepared to play this. But after knight f3, this is often played to avoid a Nimzo-Indian. And then d5. So now we're going into almost like a Queen's Gambit declined, except, well, we are in a basic Queen's Gambit. Oh, no, sorry. d5, knight c3. So now we are basically in a standard Queen's Gambit declined, except white has basically been forced to put these two knights here. And now bishop b4 can be played. Now this is basically the Rogozin defence in many ways. The Queen's Gambit declined Rogozin defence. And it's a perfectly fine opening. I think there's a course on Chessboard on it. I think the course on Chessboard actually pairs the Rogozin defence with the Queen's Gambit declined. Sorry, the Rogozin defence with the Nimzo-Indian, just like Reti's almost doing. Now the key idea about playing bishop b4 with this variation where you're starting with knight f6 and e6 to essentially provoke knight f3 is that this knight can no longer go to e2. So that's the key difference, really. The knight cannot go to e2. Now here, white has to take on d5 now or next move. And the reason is black's going to play c6 and queen a5 next. And as soon as queen a5 is played, this knight is no longer pinned. So let's say we play here, this knight is no longer pinned, which means that if white wants to take on d5 now, then black can take back with the knight. We don't want black to have this option. You know, if white took now, then taking back with the knight just hangs the queen. So white has to take back. So in this position, white has to take on d5 now or next move, because as soon as black plays queen a5, taking on d5 no longer is a valid option. So c takes d5, we have e takes d5, and now e3. Now, Reti says that this is the most natural move. Queen a4 and queen b3 are two other potential options. And we will look at queen a4 in game number 51. I think they're both fairly similar. The move orders are both quite similar. So we'll look at them in game number 51. But c5 is the main move here. And it's like we've discussed at the start. You will play the two knights here, you'll play your bishop out, and you will push c5. And now bishop to d3 and queen to a5. So it's quite similar as the Cambridge Springs variation, except we haven't wasted a move with c6. We've been able to get c5 in straight away. Now here, Alekhine castled. This is the bit which I was unsure about at the end of last game. Alekhine castled, and he's basically sacrificing his b-pawn. Now if we try and defend it with queen c2, this is a fine move. This was played by Grunfeld, and there's nothing wrong with this move at all. The variation which Reti gives is c4, attacking his bishop, bishop to f5, and now castles, rook e8, and now black is going to try and play bishop f8, g6, h6, and try and force one of these bishops to trade themselves for these knights. For instance, a3, bishop f8, say rook, rook ac1, for instance, and now g6. So this is where black will try and force white's bishops to trade for these two knights, or one of the bishops to trade for the knights. Black essentially wants to get rid of the bishop pair. And the reason it's forced is, let's say you retreat, h6 can be played, and now again you can take, or you can retreat. Now let's say g5 is played, and now you have to take here, because if you just retreat, then you'll get forked. And it's the exact same thing if you retreat here. You go to here, you have to take here, because if you just go back to here, you'll get forked. So that's the main idea of this, essentially going to try and get one of these bishops to trade themselves for the knight, to essentially get rid of the bishop pair. These two bishops are very strong, they're very active, so it makes sense to want to try and trade them off, especially because we've got two knights almost fighting over the same sort of square here. This knight is no longer trying to control e5, it's no longer trying to control c5. So you've got two knights almost fighting over the same sort of squares. So it makes sense to try and trade them off. So that's after queen c2. Now Alekhine played castles, which is actually a gambit of a pawn, because there's two attackers on here. So bishop takes, b takes, queen takes, and white's down the pawn. Now here we see c4 played, and then bishop f5. Reti comments that bishop c2 has been played as well, but it's a bit more passive, and so it's not quite as good. So bishop f5, and now bishop takes c3, b takes c3. And now it's worth noting that queen takes c3 doesn't quite work, since white can get a bit of an advantage after bishop takes f6. And The reason is, let's say, you sort of have to take with the g pawn, because after knight takes f6, you will then have bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, and then queen to a4 check. And this check is a bit nasty. You have to move the king. We're trying to win this pawn, but you also have to move the king, because if you go to here, then we can start piling up on this piece. And of course, we're still always threatening to win this pawn. Let's say rook c7. Well, then we can always throw in this in. Let's say try and go to here. We can try and throw this in, and the queen is starting to run out of spaces as well. So things start getting very difficult for black. White is activating all of their pieces. They're threatening pretty much everything. Things are getting very difficult now. So black can't really take currently. However, black does have a potential draw, essentially, and that starts with knight e4. And the reason is, after you take here, take back knight to e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and castles. Reti says that this position is quite now it's a bit dry. It's opposite colour bishops. The pawn structure is fairly symmetrical, and material is even. So it's likely going to be a draw. It's worth noting this pawn isn't hanging here, because that would be checkmate. So black has to castle here, which would potentially give white a chance to try and save this pawn. Something like queen d4, also counter-attacking the two black pawns. So that's the Westphalia Defence. Starting, let's get into the main position. So yeah, starting here, and then with a c5 move followed by queen a5. So that's the Westphalia Defence. And it started by the knight f6 move order going into the Nimzo-Indian. Or it's also called the Ragozin, as it's probably more commonly referred to these days. And so there are the two defences. You have the Westphalia Defence, and you have the Cambridge Springs Defence. And our next game we will see by Capablanca continuing his games. We will see, I believe we'll see the Westphalia Defence or the Ragozin, except after queen a4. So if you're interested in these openings, please do stick around and watch the next video. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe. I'll see you next time.